So we'll now move over to a Q&A session for Adrian and Henry. So we've got some questions that have come in. So first one is for Henry, please. So Henry, did you consider monitoring and forecasting at all?
Yes, so this was included in various questions throughout the survey. I would say that whereas others have been quite strict in that they've had specific questions relating to each of the 8 principles that Adrian expanded on, whereas ours, we had questions we felt were going to give us better information, but they might cover more principles. Also, I mentioned that this survey is now being adapted and modified to become the new IPM plans for the VI and the NFU. And we've actually added a few questions to those plans. So there is a specific question on decision support systems, for example.
Okay. And another one for Henry. How can you improve IPM uptake by low adopters compared to high adopters who value face-to-face independent advice?
This is the $1 million question, try to reach those that are less likely to engage for various reasons. Fortunately, we do have a project at the moment. SRUC and ADAS have a DEFRA and funded project, which has been supervised and coordinated by the NFU, in which we will select participants from their IPM survey scores. They will be moved into the next part of the project, in which they'll be split up into 3 different groups where they'll get different types of advice, and then there'll be a lot of behavioural studies done on the back of that to try to identify the best approaches for giving guidance and advice according to the farmer, the farm type, and in particular the farmer's personality and their behaviour. But it is a question, trying to reach those that are hard to get to turn up to these meetings is a perpetual problem. I know in Ireland, when I was working for Chuggas over there, and they introduced a scheme to basically pay people to €750 a year to attend these discussion group meetings, and I think it was 5 discussion group meetings. So that's one incentive to trying to get people to turn up, is by offering a financial.
Yeah. Was there a difference in IPM adoption with land ownership, so between owner-occupiers and rented farms?
I think within our survey sample, some of the questions we'd like to ask, we perhaps didn't have the numbers to, because we only had 200 respondents. And actually, land tenures or long-term rentals are much less common in Ireland than they perhaps are in England, so it does create some issues there. But it's certainly something we need to look into a bit more.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions for Adrian that have come in. So, product labels are confusing. Can they be simplified and standardised to make simpler?
I think that's a perennial point, and something that we always try and look at. We are always balancing the need for more information with simplicity, but entirely take the point, and we'll feed it back to colleagues as part of our. I can't see you smiling, Nicola. But yeah, thanks. But it's a good point.
Yeah. Can you expand on what you mean by weed thresholds? They can be unreliable if you just use density.
Yeah, I mean, the word thresholds in the Sustainable Use Directive, etc., is obviously talking about pest thresholds. It gets harder as you try and apply it to sort of pests that mean weeds. As the questioner rightly says, I think I would need to rely on sort of scientific colleagues, probably that are on this sort of conference, to say, right, well, what's the best measure? And that's what it's all about. It's about sort of the expert community coming up with measures that people can practically apply. I think is and comes back to Henry's point about knowledge transfer and exchange as well. So I think that's all related. Thanks.
I think this question probably applies to both of you. Do we need to simplify the definition of IPM? Is this the barrier to adoption?
I'll let Henry go first.
Thanks for that. Well, there are a lot of different definitions as to what IPM means, according to who you're talking to. that's why it's usually easier to refer to the FAO and the EU one, because it is published, it's written down, it's undisputed. But usually when I'm talking about IPM, I talk about a holistic approach to pest management that's ecologically and economically sustainable. So that's generally what I'm speaking about when I'm talking about IPM. I don't know if Adrian had anything else to add to that.
I think that sums it up in a nutshell, Henry. It is about getting, and I think your project highlighted it, that there's a lot of practices that people are doing that they've always done that they don't necessarily see as IPM, and that could be added into the package. And I think this is, we've got this sort of not new but buzz phrase, which is probably new for sort of broadacre crops more so than sort of horticultural crops perhaps. And as I say, how do you apply that? And for our part, obviously not directly relevant to this conference, is things like the amenity sector. When you're talking about, how do you do integrated management when you're talking about roads, and then you get back into building and sort of the pre-planning stage, a bit like crop rotation. So yeah, I think Henry's sort of working definition is spot on. Thanks.
Yeah. So Henry, blackgrass IPM arguably became more widespread when herbicide efficacy diminished. It looks as though, apart from brome, other weeds are not mentioned. Did you encounter any concerns from growers there might be a risk in performance of IPM compared to what they're currently doing if that works well?
Okay, yeah, so that is one of the main drivers to IPM uptake. If the wheels are falling off in terms of the pesticides not working, then that's forcing people to adopt IPM. So yep, certainly take that point. The question on other weeds, I mean, we asked for their top 3 or 5 pests, and those are the only weeds that came up were blackgrass, wild oats, and sterile brome. So we don't have any information on the other one.
Okay.
And the second part of that question, again, we're talking about IPM as in you practice IPM or not, but it's very much a continuum from, we had people scoring sort of 27% to people scoring in the 90s. So try to have a question in which you would say, is your practice more or less risky than an IPM practice? I don't know how we'd really do that, but it's certainly something that would come out of these sort of social science projects we've got off the back of this, where I try to understand some of the reasons why individuals are not practicing IPM. And certainly there could be lots of associated risks with any sort of change in practice, particularly just one that's more environmentally friendly.
Okay, thank you. So back to Adrian now. Will there be a more holistic approach for pesticide registration in the future to help prevent resistance by maintaining as many modes of action as possible?
And I think that's a good question. And I think it comes out in things like how you do an active substance review program, which is obviously something that we're starting to think about. How rather than just reviewing active substances one at a time in chronological order, getting a more sophisticated way of doing it so that you actually look across, either a crop sector or something like that, and that would help you take account of it. So I think it's a very good question, and that sort of thing. Obviously at the moment we're operating within the sort of existing rules, but with fixes. But going forward, there will be opportunities to do things a bit differently. Some that may require legislative changes, which would take longer to put into effect, but some that we may be able to do in terms of our own processes within the legislation, and that sort of thing might. Would be figured in there if we could. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So another one for you, Adrian. Will IPM adopters be financially supported by the government in the same way as arable stewardship worked in the past?
I think the critical thing here is there is a big sort of join up between the whole sort of IPM and the development of the environmental land management schemes. That's the critical place for it. And those sort of issues are being fed into that discussion. DEFRA policy colleagues are obviously closer to the action than I am, but that's certainly the intention.
And it's one of the goals of this project I mentioned that SRUC and ADAS have, is to try to work out basically potentially where subsidies or financial incentives should lie in order to improve IPM uptake across the board.
Okay. Adrian, does DEFRA recognise the need for maintaining yield in order to minimise environmental impact of food production?
I'm not sure whether I'm best placed to answer that, but I think it is a critical thing. This whole, how does the environmental strategy through the 25-year plan join up with the sustainable food production strategy? Again, we've got everything has to be looked at in the round rather than just sort of, drive in one particular direction. And I'm sure DEFRA colleagues sort of are on the piece with that, as it were. So I think it's a very good question, and of the need to join all these things up. Thanks.
That's great, thank you. Let's see if there's any other ones there. So get another one for Adrian. Will there be a replacement for 1107/2009 once we
1107 effectively gets retained in national legislation, so it's just referred to as retained EU law, with fixes to replace, and the legislation is out there on sort of gov.uk. There are obviously operability fixes in there to, references to the Commission and EFSA and things like that have been changed into national sort of references, as it were. But otherwise, the fundamental sort of legislation stays the same, because the whole point of implementing EU legislation into national law at speed was that there weren't to be any policy changes. So it's just fixes to bring it all into national legislation so that we have a national regime from the 1st of January, which we will have.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Thank you to our first two speakers. I think that's been a great introduction to integrated weed management.